Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining our Dion Leadership monthly webinar series. Today, we are talking about the Looming Talent Exodus, and I have our founder and CEO with us, Steve Dion, as well as James Reid from Dinsmore, and Kris Lehman, who is one of our coaches and consultants on our team.
Thanks, Lauren, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining our monthly webinar, and good to see you, James. Good to see you, Kris.
Great to be here.
Well, we picked this topic today because we wanted to raise awareness of the importance of a business problem that might not be immediately in your sight, but we think it's very important. And the expected talent shortage is out there, and it's going to be brought on by many different factors. And today we want to particularly focus on sort of the post-pandemic baby boomer retirement wave. And we're going to share with you some information about kind of why we see this as a problem and talk about both the legal things for you to consider as well as some programmatic items. But to set the stage, imagine that stereotypical like action movie where there's a hero that's kind of saving a bad guy or saving somebody from a bad guy, and they're in the scene and they've got this sort of action thing happen, and everything culminates and you go, this is great. And they stop and they're tired and they're like, we made this happen. And they have some meaningful dialogue, and you as a watcher of this screen look and realize that the bigger picture is there's like a fire below them. There's another thing waiting to happen in the movie. And you're like, get going, you guys, you don't see it happening. And that's what's really happening in this scenario, I think, is we're in this COVID crisis situation where, we're in the middle of this action scene fighting the bad guys, but there's another looming crisis out there and the floor is ready to drop with the fire. And hopefully today we can motivate you to think about this as a really key, important subject. And I wanted to quickly say that Kris is, as Lauren mentioned, is one of our coaches and consultants. He will be leading the programmatic side of our discussion today. And gosh, Kris, we've known each other for a good decade, I think. And Kris is an outstanding executive coach and a real gifted facilitator. And I'm excited to have you here with us today.
Great, good to be with you. Thanks, Steve.
The other thing that Kris brings to the table, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is he spent some time in getting a retirement coaching certification. So this kind of came about in the conversations we were having about what that looks like and how does leading at that stage in your career play out. James is, gosh, we've known each other for 5-6 years, I think, and have been partnering on a few different projects throughout your career. And James's background is focusing particularly on employment and business matters in law. And you're also president of Michigan SHRM, I know.
That's all true, and looking forward to this tough topic.
Well, let me just set the stage with some data, and then I'll turn it over to you guys to kind of take us through this today. So what are some of the mega trends that we're seeing related to the talent exodus? Well, the first one, and you probably have heard this for many, many years, is, baby boomer retirements. And that's been a conversation for a while, but I'm going to share with you some data about how important that really is as it's coming to fruition as we speak. But on top of that, we have a whole gig economy happening right now where more and more workers, older workers, lots of workers are moving to a gig economy. And what we mean by that is, temporary, flexible jobs of people that are working for organizations in part-time capacities. In one recent study I was looking at, 36% of workers participate in some level of the gig economy. So that's like 59 million Americans. And as we think about post-pandemic work, you may see more people even engaging in this type of work. Gen Zs, on top of this, so the workers that you're going to have for a long time, they're demanding more flexibility in the workforce. They've been working from home. There are a lot of challenges that they are bringing to the organization to say, I need you to solve this for me to stay here and want to work. On top of that, a great amount of women have left the workforce. I mean, about 3 million women have left the workforce during COVID because of childbearing main responsibilities. So the combination of the pandemic itself Gen Z saying, I want to do different things, women leaving the workforce, the gig economy. All this is a perfect storm to say, as your organizations come back, they're going to have some talent issues. And some of the statistics that back that up are right here. So about 10,000 baby boomers are turning 65 every single day. So we've been talking about this baby boomer issue, but it's real now. There's about a 5 million worker shortage as it's been seen right now. And I know many of the organizations that we work with are saying they're having trouble finding workers at any level and any size in their organization. About 40% of workers, it's a couple of studies that recently came out. Many of you probably have seen this. 40% of workers are saying they are unlikely to stay with their organization post-pandemic. So there've been a lot of studies about, I'm working at home, I don't want to drive an hour anymore, I want to see where this plays out. This is both the baby boomer generation and some newer folks. So this is going to kind of come together in a full storm soon. 57% of baby boomers who still are there are not sharing information. So the other issue is not only are people going to stay or go, but when they do exit, how do they leave behind institutional knowledge? And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And then only 25% of organizations are saying they're actually managing the aging workforce well and effectively. So that's really why we wanted to have this topic today. Real quickly, for those of you that don't know who Dion Leadership is, we are an organizational development and leadership consulting firm. And this is our mission. We believe that people in organizations do better when employees start every day excited and end every day accomplished. So our coaches and consultants, Kris being one of those, is one of those folks that make this happen for us. And so we'd like to bring topics each month that help bring into this particular space of what we do. And these are our different solutions. Today, kind of this topic resonates mostly to solving it via leadership coaching, talent assessment, and primarily in this organizational capabilities bucket, or aligning strategy, structure, and processes. And then in closing about us, and I'll turn it over to James to kind of walk us through, kind of starting with the legal elements of this, is our client partners. So many of these partners have told us that they're having trouble with hiring staff, that they're concerned about flattening the talent exodus curve as well. So that was part of our motivation for having this topic today, is to help clients like this to think about their global workforce and help to manage that. Before we get into this, so I forgot we threw in a poll here. So if I could ask everybody to quickly answer to see where you're at related to this topic. Does your organization have an established program for effectively transitioning workers to retirement? So I thought it would be helpful to get a sense of what other organizations are or aren't doing. And just a real simple 3-part answer, either yes, we have an established program, somewhat, or no. And that would be like the 25% of folks in the organizational study. So just wanted to get a sense of our audience here and where we're at, and that'll help us guide the conversation for our discussion today. So reports are in, and 62% of folks are saying they have no formal plan. It's really not even on their radar. And 15% do have a well-established plan, and 23% of the folks are somewhat in the middle. So that's honestly about what I was thinking we were going to see today, is a little bit across the board, but primarily folks that don't have a plan yet. So let's see if we can help with that. James?
Excellent. And I love how your mission is to have everyone excited and accomplished. And Dinsmore's slogan is accomplish more. So we have, over 700 attorneys and licensed in 35 states. So it's similar vision statements for both of us. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about the legal issues. It's really funny because in professional services, CPA firms and law firms, they've had mandatory retirement at age 65. You have to get out. And right now at Dinsmore, we have at age 65, you can no longer be an equity owner at Dinsmore. And actually, that's one of the things that attracted me to join Dinsmore. So it's funny that we're now saying, be careful what you wish for, because maybe that will be a problem either now or sometime in the future. And the reason why in many CPA firms and law firms and other professional service firms, you can essentially force retirement is because when you're a K-1 owner, you're not considered an employee. So in this context, if you are actually an employee, a W-2 worker, you have federal and state law rights that apply to you. And under those laws, you can not be terminated on the basis of age. And I'm actually 41 years old, so I'm deemed in that protected class under federal law, where if they thought they wanted to retire me early so they could hire younger, cheaper labor, that would be an illegal act. Michigan specifically actually has the reverse. You can actually be protected for being too young as well. But under this law, we have to be very careful how we're having our conversations. So you don't want the 65-year-olds to just retire and not transition their knowledge and not give you a heads up that, they're going to retire with no notice or 2 weeks notice, because I'm sure, as Steve and Kris could, show with authority, is that it takes about a year or two to find a replacement for someone at the key employee level. So you definitely want to have a couple of years heads up. So I think a better way to approach it is not say, you're looking like you're at the end of your rainbow, are you ready to retire? Instead, say, what are your goals? Are you accomplishing them? What is your vision in the future? And maybe you want to create a voluntary retirement program to gauge interests and say, if we created a program not based on age, but based on years of service, that would be a legal way to incentivize people to retire and transfer their knowledge, or identify a position maybe that is more of a gig position or flexible position that essentially has a job description that requires employees to manage and train mentees and transition their knowledge to other employees. And in that regard, when we're doing evaluations, we can't just rely on the general vice president or manager title. We got to get into the nuts and bolts of what are they actually doing, because every position is unique, and we want them to identify, what are the 10 reasons of why you're deserving of praise? What should we be excited about? And that'll get employees to continue updating their job description and their duties. But in some cases, if you all of a sudden give an older worker less work and find a newer worker that you've trained and transitioned to, those older workers are going to complain that they were constructively discharged. What that means is fired without being told they were fired. So if all of a sudden you give them a lesser bonus or you give them less job responsibilities, they could sue you for saying that they want to get lost pay from the date of termination through the date they actually want to retire. Because when someone over 40 or especially over 60 is terminated, their damages would be, it's harder for me to get a job now that I'm already in my 60s. So I need you to bridge that gap until my retirement, so they could actually bring $1 million constructive discharge claim. So it's more important than ever that we train our managers on how to give feedback and communicate with these older workers. Number one, gauge their interest. Two, it looks like we want them in most businesses to stay longer than normal. So how do we create that carrot to keep them on board, which I propose an executive employment agreement, maybe give them some comfort where if they achieve certain goals for the company, they can make money by the success of training subordinates beneath them. And we want to make sure that you gauge the amount of time. So it's not blatantly illegal to ask somebody, what are their plans? How many more years do they plan on, working with the company? Those things are okay as long as you do it in the right context and aren't solely talking to people that are of a certain age. And some of the best stories I can tell you is that if you were to make them feel like they're being replaced, they're going to want to build a claim against you. So instead, say, I value you, I enjoy your talent. How can you help us continue your legacy and do it as a way where we're empowering them and not taking away their power is the best way to handle this. Also, if you are terminating some of the older workers, a legal strategy is to also terminate maybe some of the younger workers at the same time, or that way it doesn't appear to be age discrimination. Also, before you replace the new CEO and the new president with someone that is younger, it may be best to have the current C-suite that is already mostly older make those hard decisions on who needs to retire early or who needs to be exited. So that way it's older workers exiting older workers and not a younger worker newly in that position cleaning house by essentially terminating everyone that is older than them. Next slide.
Thanks, James. That is a great overview. And I know as we get into some of the initiatives, we can talk a little bit more and have some Q&A. I know in this particular case, why we wanted to bring this up is we hear from organizations that they have programmatic solutions, but they're not so sure what kind of conversations they can have. So the idea of what you just shared will help people give more comfort to having that dialogue and the proactive dialogue you were just talking about. So let's get into
just
some
real
of it.
quick on the ADEA, that's like alphabet soup for the 40 and over law. If you were going to create a based on years of service retirement plan, for example, Dinsmore says you get essentially 1% per year worked of the top pay you've ever had over some phase out. And if you were to have this plan, you can't tell employees to sign it today or it's off the table. Under the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, you have to give them 21 days to review the document, because once you're over 40, you're deemed slow enough to need more time to process. And even after you sign, you get 7 days to change your mind, saying, just kidding, I signed that without knowing what I was getting into. And if you're ever laying off or retiring 2 or more workers, that 21 days changes to 45 days. So if you're out, this is not only retirement, this is also a separation. So be aware of the 21-day and 45-day legal requirements. And if you're going to terminate more than one person under that 45-day window, you have to create a chart of the age and position of all the other employees that are being exited or retired, so that they can evaluate if they believe age is involved.
Great. And that is whether you're feeling the need because of the business issues to actually downsize and exit people, or even if you're going to create an incentive plan, as we're going to talk about next, to retain somebody or maybe modify their work in a post-retirement type mode.
Exactly. And there's special legalese that has to be in those disclosures.
Okay, great. So we've identified 6 specific initiatives that we think you could consider to look at this workforce and look at what's going on in the world and the economy and be able to create some win-win solutions to keep these workers in a place that's most valuable. Kris, you want to lead us through the 6?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So as Steve mentioned, there is a projected shortfall of qualified workers in the future. And we have the potential of having an exit of a significant pool of workers that capture a lot of knowledge, experience, and skill that may walk out the door. So what we want to talk about is, one, how do we potentially extend the duration that they are in the organization that might help address some of that projected shortfall of talent? And then also, how can we potentially ensure that there is a meaningful transition of knowledge, and also make it a positive type of bridge and transition so that all parties really see this as a win-win. So we'll talk about the 6 themes that we identified through research. One of them is relatively new that we're introducing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So one of the first areas that we think has a lot of potential is what we call rethinking the work. And so there's the potential of really identifying what are the factors that contribute to what some authors describe as good work, which is really work that is meaningful and matters to the individual. So it's kind of work that's good for them, that's kind of good for the soul to a certain extent. And then you have the ability to identify and leverage strengths. So this kind of builds off of the strength-based leadership initiatives that I think we have for every employee. But this recognizes that what their strengths and interests are may change and evolve, especially as they get into the tail end of their formal career. So can we kind of capitalize on that interest and put them into roles that really are uniquely tailored to their interests and skills? The third item, seeking opportunities for, go back 1 second, Steve, seeking opportunities for reskilling. This is really an opportunity to ensure that people are learning and growing at every stage of their career, and not assuming that once you get to the final stages or in that home stretch, that people are not interested in kind of reskilling or upskilling. So that would be one of the things to kind of be mindful of. People have that desire. And as a kind of an affiliated point, I thought it was interesting, we talk about harness the entrepreneurial talents and interests of this group. People between the ages of 55 and 64 have proven to be the most entrepreneurial of any age category, because those are the folks who are going out and creating some new businesses. So if we can kind of capitalize that and harness that potentially in our own organization, we might be able to retain some of that talent. The next piece is what we call phased retirement or a reduced schedule. And so one of the things that we've seen is that a lot of folks leave an organization because they need additional flexibility. And so one of our thoughts is that, well, if we can provide some of that flexibility while they're in the organization, might they consider staying longer and being part of the organization? And so one of the things that we know that we see as a general trend is that people at this age often have elderly parents that they're trying to take care of. And so if they get extended flexibility, then they may not have to essentially retire or leave that workplace in order to continue to work. The other aspect of this is that a phased retirement really allows for a test drive of the individual to that new role. And so a lot of research suggests that many people are doing a lot of planning around the financial aspects, but the mental, the social, the emotional aspects really aren't accounted for. And this helps make a more phased transition to that. And then our last bullet there, increases the likelihood of a planned knowledge transfer. And it kind of is common sense from the standpoint of, rather than having a 1 or 2 meeting kind of transition and getting it all crammed in, if you've got some gradual phased reduction of hours and work, then it makes for an easier handoff and a smoother transition. The other area that has been identified, and this kind of speaks to the gig economy that Steve had mentioned before, is that people who are contemplating retirement are really looking at 3 themes that we identified in terms of a post-career transition. One is flexibility, which we've kind of referenced. The other is connection, and finally is monetary benefits. So what's nice about this is that these all dovetail nicely into the creation and kind of exploration of special projects or freelance work of those people who've been in your organization. And then the synergy of this is that if you can give people the kind of the view and the window into, well, at the end, when you decide to make a more formal transition, we'd like to retain you in some special capacity that has the potential of really increasing their engagement and their motivation to the end of their full-time employment, rather than viewing this as kind of a long, slow glide path into retirement. So it really has the potential to be a synergistic option for both the organization and the individual. Then there's the expanded benefit program. And so referenced the flexibility issue before. So if there is this interest in continuing to work, but what I really need from a potential post-career move is I'd like to have some degree of flexibility. Well, working reduced hours while retaining some additional benefits would be a nice kind of attractive option to a lot of folks. And when I hear from HR professionals and leaders talk about, well, I don't know if we can increase our expenses around that. My first thought is that, well, there are expenses with transition, right? There's the cost of search and then the retraining of folks. So this isn't necessarily a cost plus. This could be a way of a cost benefit from the standpoint of you're retaining someone who is a high performer and long-term experience and has kind of institutional knowledge. So when people look at what are the things that attract me, flexibility is going to be a key driver to that. And then the other thing I'd point out is that benefits don't necessarily just mean, medical benefits or financial benefits. It can be in the neighborhood of a lot of things that really support someone in making that transition and making their life easier. So if you do have responsibility for care of elderly parents, having some resources, referrals, or support groups, that can be just as meaningful, if not more so, in terms of making life easier for someone who's coming up to a challenging transition in life, so that becomes an attractive option to say, hey, they're making my life easier in so many different fronts. I like what I'm doing, and I get the benefit of kind of organizational resources that make this transition a little bit easier for me. Then one of the things that I think people are pretty familiar with is a mentoring program, but this is really specifically geared toward making the knowledge transfer. And that's been so important. And one of the things that we see as an Achilles heel within organizations is that most folks don't really share their knowledge before they leave the organization. I think about a quarter of the population leaves without any knowledge transfer whatsoever. Which is a huge void there, right? So when we think of mentoring in these kind of situations, we'd say that people who are approaching a career transition of retirement, it really helps capitalize on their motivation to make a difference. So it really feeds that intrinsic value and satisfaction that they would gain by virtue of perhaps an expanded role or a different role than what they've had before. And this is particularly key in what we say in describing the institutional, social, and relationship knowledge. So this goes far beyond the technical or job-related skills. It really encompasses some of those hard to convey aspects around organizational life. And it gives a person a mentor in terms of navigating that. It can be a tricky and filled with potential landmines if they're not more aware. And then anyone who has been in a mentor relationship can probably appreciate this, but we would say that both the mentor and the mentee gain benefit. So naturally, the mentee is the recipient of knowledge and information and wisdom, but the mentor also gets that intrinsic satisfaction and kind of meaning that's created through that. So if anyone has mentored or coached another person before, you can probably identify with the kind of the rush of, feel good associated with that you're really making a difference, you're making an impact, and this really capitalizes on that.
Two quick things that are worth mentioning is because of the Me Too movement, many older men especially are afraid to be a mentor to younger women. So I think you want to make sure that you train those executives and those older workers on how to mentor in a way that is socially responsible. You're not going to have one-on-one closed door meetings anymore. You're not going to necessarily just go to lunch alone or drive in the same car. So make sure you're aware of those legal issues to avoid those potential claims. And then second, you want to start this process in the beginning and not wait until someone's 65 to make them a mentor, because then they're going to feel there's a game being played to transfer their knowledge and exit them.
Great, thanks, James. So this is a nice bridge to what we are introducing as Capstone Coaching. And to kind of jump off, one of the things that James had mentioned is that mentoring is not necessarily a skill that everyone possesses without the benefit of some training and potential coaching. So this really formalizes and develops a process and a plan for the knowledge transfer, which again, we see that really leaks out of organizations at an alarming rate. In fact, if we were to look at, I think there's been a big move on waste, and if you look at a manufacturing environment and trying to reduce waste, and I think that movement has migrated into organizations at all levels. One of the key components of waste that we've seen is the waste of resource and talent that just goes out the door without any benefit of attempting to retain that. So we would say it provides an intentional mechanism for the employee to develop a post-career plan as well. So when we think about the stressful events in people's lives, retirement is actually on the top 10 list. So if someone is contemplating a post-career transition, there's some apprehension and some anxiety associated with that. So we would say, if you can help create some understanding and a game plan to kind of navigate that period, then they're going to be, more likely to be engaged, motivated, and performing at a higher level while they're actually still in the organization. So we think that there's kind of a twofold benefit from that perspective. Then we also would suggest that it really demonstrate a commitment to employees at every stage of the career transition. So not just when you join, then we put a lot of resources to you. It really helps follow the whole full life cycle of an employee. And so you're modeling to other employees in the organization the care, concern, and genuineness of helping people at every stage, regardless of whether it's at the beginning or near the end of their career. And then ultimately, you've got the potential of creating what we would say is ambassadors for your organization, because there is going to be this shortage of talent, and one of the untapped potential resources of talent will be an older population. And so if you've created an environment where people feel valued, respected, and appreciated, then they're going to share that with other folks in their community. So we think that there's a win-win from that perspective as well. So that gives you kind of the highlights of what we are thinking of regarding the Capstone Coaching program, but Steve can kind of walk through a specific roadmap for you.
Thanks, Kris. So as I listen to those first 5 items, one of the things that I see, whether it's the Rethink the Work part or any of this, is there's some challenges with organizations from a perception of equity, a perception of fairness, concerns with the legal conversations we've had. Do you have how do you talk about this in succession planning? And so this Capstone Coaching program or idea provides the ability to have those conversations in that safe way and to look for win-win solutions. So you may not know up front if you want to offer somebody a part-time role, a mentoring role, but engaging in the, hey, you're talking about your next 3 to 5 year plan. Let's engage this process to help you think about that and stay as motivated as you can, leave a legacy, and tap in, as Kris mentioned, to those entrepreneurial ideas and the amount of skill that somebody has in an organization. So for those of you that have worked with our other coaching programs and lanes, we already have sort of 5 coaching lanes to map the coaching situation. So there's a leadership coaching program or process to work with the leader kind of at the height of their career on a multiple set of behaviors. We have a leader integration program. So you're a new leader. What does that look like? We have a targeted program, talent fit coaching. We're not sure if this person fits the organization, emerging leader. This is another lane that helps you work through coaching over the course of 6 months. So this is geared around our targeted coaching program size of a program, but very specific lanes that say, here's what we would do with the coachee as we help them think about their runway here. What do they have left to do? Where do they want this to go? What does this mean for them personally? What does it mean for them professionally? How do I engage the organization and allow somebody, as James mentioned, the ability to declare up front to say, yeah, I'm going to make my definition of leaving at this time. I'm not going to keep it to myself and walk in one day and say 30 days before, hey, I'm done, and leave people, scampering. It allows, and it's a tough conversation to have. I've talked to many organizations that, the person's not sure how to say it, what to say, when to say it. Does it mean I'll get pushed out early? Whereas if you say, as an organization, we have this program, it honors this transition that's difficult for you, but it also gives you the ability to be creative about the work that you're going to do. We think it's a real win-win solution and situation. As part of this, as I mentioned, Kris has got this coaching retirement kind of perspective that we have an assessment that even helps somebody walk them through on the individual side. What am I looking to get out of this for my future career, for my post-career life? But at the employer level, what they're getting is that conversation of how do I map who's going to be in this job, what does it look like, and make it really open and transparent. So we found that many of our clients have pockets of situations where for some reason, this one person was allowed this one opportunity to do this sort of one-off job because of sort of who they were at a moment in time, and it was a win-win. We're suggesting that all organizations would be much better if they had a programmatic solution that said, let's look at all of our workers. Not that you need to do this for everybody or that everybody needs have an alternate work arrangement or work longer, but don't just let it sort of happen because some savvy executive figured out how they could navigate that. The organization should drive what that would look like. And then particularly when you would do it is on this slide here. So kind of when is capstone coaching appropriate? Here's a list of those items. And this is something, you might choose to do internally. You don't have to do this with us. I mean, we know how to do coaching, of course, but you could internally say, I'm going to work with somebody on the plan to leave the organization and just make it purposeful. So part of what we're giving you here is the idea of this process. And the outcomes are on the right side here. So, what you want to have happen is somebody leave an organization in a way that everybody else is, wow, they treat people well. The work is well buttoned up. All of the, opportunities for thinking about productivity are there for the long haul. It's just a win-win, really, we think, for everybody. And it allows, again, for a conversation that probably wouldn't have had occurred had you not had some way to facilitate this transition with somebody. Did I miss anything, guys, on that?
I think you summed it up nicely, Steve.
Okay. So as we get into the last few slides, we kind of have a summary of kind of how to have effective conversations and sort of 4 leave behind points. We'd love to hear in the chat what questions you have for Kris or James, as well as if you want to type in some other things you're doing that we didn't cover that might be helpful for our community as a learning program here. But please use the chat to kind of communicate with us some both ideas of what you are doing that others might want to do, and if you have any questions. So then to move into some tips for having that first conversation.
Thanks, Steve. So this conversation is a legal process. So definitely managers and above need some level of legal training and legal understanding on how to navigate the landmines. During your conversation, you may find out that someone has cancer or early stages of dementia or has some other disability or protected class issue. Once you're aware of those things, a lot of executives are, you can't factor that into your discussions or decision. So what every company needs is a committee that is ideally diverse, men, women, different ages, different races and nationalities, that help make decisions and isn't just one person that may have too much information, because right now unconscious bias is the hottest legal claim across the country. They're saying that it's not criminal law, it's civil law. And if you unconsciously factored in something, you're still just as guilty as if you intentionally made that decision. So be careful not to speak in terms of conclusions. Don't say, we need this conclusion or your performance is at this conclusion. Focus on back to first grade. So my son is in first grade and he's learning how to tell a story. And every story has the 5 W's. Can someone type in the chat box what those are? It's who, what, where, when, why. And then there's 2 more W's that a lawyer always needs to train executives on how to communicate. What are those 2 other W's? And whatever is not one of them. What would a lawyer want to know when there's different perspectives about an employee? Witnesses. Witnesses are extremely important. So whenever you're documenting a decision, identify witnesses. But the most important W I have not said yet. The most important W that Steve and Kris have been talking about this entire webinar is how to get employees excited. What do they want? And if you focus on what somebody wants, you might even be able to skip the other 6 W's, because if they want to stay on longer and add this value and have some type of incentive compensation, you might want to say yes, and you've already come to an agreement. And when you're having this conversation, that brings you to number 2, what I call the I message. That's where you don't want to point the finger. You want to start with I, the thumb, and say, I feel that we could, train even more people to help support you, and help us grow even more and transfer, more knowledge, more training, more mentoring. Talk in terms of I. If you say you need to do this, you need to do that, someone feels that they're getting more responsibility without more pay necessarily, or they're getting talked down to and being condescending, or essentially being accused of not doing enough. So the I message, I also use this at home with my spouse and with my friends. So it's a great tool to use anywhere you go. And I'll pass number 3 to Steve.
Yeah, and to jump on to that, both of those two really speak to this third one, is be supportive. But don't just be supportive in the words, be supportive in the way you come across, in your mindset about this, in the idea that you realize that this person's making some big life changes. And it's not just what you say, it's also sort of how you say it. You can have multiple people there to have witnesses, but you can do that in a way that says, hey, let's have an open, real conversation. And a lot of organizations fear to ask somebody what they want for fear that they're going to start a conversation that backs somebody into a corner. But it isn't really that at all. The more you can know about somebody, you can always say, that's great. Here's why I don't think that can work around here, blah, 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 but be able to understand it first is really important. So start with being supportive and not direct somebody, especially if they work somewhere for a long time, they know this place inside and out. They don't want to be talked to and lectured to about something like this. And when we are having the conversation, the last one is provide a process to build your transition plan. You don't have to come in with all the answers. A lot of times people don't want to have the conversation because they don't know where it's going to go. The conversation is, let's talk about the process where we can build a plan. It's not, I have to leave this conversation with a plan. Those are 2 very different things. This Capstone Coaching program can absolutely help facilitate that plan, but there's lots of ways you could do that. You could do that in your succession planning process as well. But it's inviting that conversation through the, where are you going to be 3 years from now? Oh, I don't think I'm going to be here anymore. Well, now let's talk that conversation. What does that look like, sound like? What are the plans? And be ready to be prescriptive. And don't leave it to the person to figure out. Don't leave it to the leader to say, well, if you can get somebody to say yes to what you want, have at it. I mean, we should own helping that person navigate what this might look like in and around the organization. So if you do these 4 things well, we think you're going to have very healthy, appropriate conversations that will engage people for the long haul to stay at the organization.
Yeah, and I think, one more tip, when you're talking to people that are, various generations, we have different communication styles. We could spend a whole hour on this. So, I've learned lessons the hard way when I'm communicating with someone typically in their 60s. They don't like it if I just send them an email when I could have talked to them in person. So make sure when you're having this conversation, you're giving them the environment they need to be comfortable and not looking like you're being combative or emails get misinterpreted or disrespectful to how important a nice in-person conversation can be.
So a couple of takeaways we wanted to make sure we accentuated here. One is, do your workforce analysis. Understand where your organizations are with this. We've had a few requests this year where organizations are wanting to do succession planning for C-level executives because all of a sudden they just looked and said, wow, I didn't realize that out of our top 40 executives, 35 of them are over 65 years old. You sometimes don't catch that, I tend to think I'm still, 18 years old until I look in the mirror, and you just, time flies, and it's important to know where you're at right now and where you think your organization is related to the likelihood of somebody exiting. The second one is to create and market programs. I mean, be able to make this public about how you would go forth in helping somebody leave. I think for most organizations, it's a mystery. Somebody doesn't know what you do when you're ready to leave and exit. It's sort of a one-time, one-off situation. So being able to say, we have this Capstone coaching program. We offer flexible work arrangements. I mean, hybrid work is now the one of the leading conversations organizations are having in this post-pandemic world. That's just some of the where you work and when you work. But that extends particularly to this organization. It might be how long you work, how often you work, what size job you have. I mean, create programs and make it safe to have a conversation. And as we just talked about, have open, respectful, and clear discussions. Be okay having a discussion without knowing where it's going, but do it the ways we talked about, but have the conversation. And then lastly, once you've made a commitment to somebody or have a plan, or even if they're not sure what it looks like and they've declared they plan to stay for 5 years and you're good with that and all's good, check in regularly. Have a process to go back to that person, see if things have changed. As we mentioned, people have ailing, family members. Somebody says, this was my plan until my spouse got sick, my parents got ill, my kids moved across the country, and now something's different. So you need to have times to regroup and understand, so you don't get that knock on the door and says, hey, I'm leaving in 30 days, go figure it out. And then last, and I think Kris did a good job of explaining this throughout the presentation here, is approach this as a business competitive advantage. Don't approach this as a necessary evil that you have to manage. If organizations can tap into and use their workforce that are very experienced in creative ways, in a way that works for everybody else, that some younger worker says, I get why this person works 2 days a week or does this other job or is mentoring this person and it's not traditional, that's value for your customer, for your shareholder, for however you measure your business. So see this workforce as a competitive advantage, not just how to tap into the Gen Zs and understand how they bring the most to the table, but these baby boomers and how they may be able to work with you and for you in a different capacity for what you thought might have been a year, could be a decade, depending on what the job is and the situation and their person's personal life. So there's a lot of win-wins there.
And I would say the timing right now is better than ever, because I have a lot of clients asking me, I don't think a lot of the baby boomers are ever going to come back to the workplace ever again. So you may want to have a conversation now about, I see you're working remotely. What job duties can you accomplish remotely? What can't you? What are your plans? It might be a great time to update your remote work agreements and your job descriptions. And as part of that process, naturally feel out intentions.
And just to build off of what you had said, Steve, in terms of competitive advantage, I thought it was interesting that one study referenced leaders and HR professionals as citing that the aging workforce was a potential competitive disadvantage, and about 20% to a quarter felt like that. And so, what that suggests to me is that those organizations who have that kind of mindset are probably going to be losers in this, right? It's the winners are going to be the folks who are proactive in this process and see not necessarily a problem, but an opportunity in terms of differentiation of how do they make themselves different and how do they make themselves attractive to this workforce and how do they facilitate that transition. So essentially, is the old adage of, if you're proactive, you're going to have a much better opportunity of being successful than if you're reactive to this and then kind of in midstream go, oh my gosh, we've got a problem.
Well said. So as we do our closing, last chance to type in some chats or questions. We have answered some of these along the way. One question I would ask to the group, though, is when we think about this aging or older workforce, what age would you consider we should start to think about people that might have sort of post-retirement plans. I know in the past we've talked about 65, 67. I hear some organizations and people saying, you know, I don't want to work past 55. Like, what's the demographic here we should be thinking about?
And while we're getting those answers, a SHRM statistic said that over half of the workforce will have a gig side job, if not permanent job, in the next 2 years. So I'm highly concerned that a lot of people in their 50s and 60s, if they're not fully motivated to stay at that company, they may be a consultant or create their own company and have a side, maybe competitive job opportunity. So it's a great time to also button up your confidentiality, non-solicit, and non-compete agreements as well.
Thanks. I'm seeing in chat like 60s, maybe an age. I mean, you can't start at 40 because it's protected class. I don't think that's probably not a practical age. But I think the idea of not waiting till 65 to start having these conversations is probably helpful, especially for those key and essential workers that we're talking about.
And I would argue anyone that has more than 20 years experience at the company should probably be part of that conversation as a key employee.
And another question, what term should we use to talk about retiring workers, older workers, aging workers? What is there a appropriate, respectful, but descriptive terminology we should use?
I'm a big fan of succession planning. I would not want to use older workers in the conversation at all, because that's a protected class that you would be identifying. So I would just say experienced workers, years of service, you know, anyone based on this amount of years of service or this amount of years of experience at all in the industry at any job, that's those people you want to have the conversation with. So it's based on experience and not age.
Okay, well, let's close up. Guys, I appreciate all of the wisdom you brought to this. Hopefully this gives the audience some food for consideration. A couple of things I just wanted to share too. We published an article on this subject. So Kris and I co-wrote an article that you may have seen in our social media post that was just published in CEO World magazine on this exact subject with this exact title. A lot of the quotes that the statistics we referenced today have hyperlinks in that to the original source. And Lauren just put that in the chat about our next webinar. So our next webinar is on creating positive race relations. We're going to do that with another one of our coaches, Dr. Taylor Cox, who's an expert, is a previous professor, has written 3 books on diversity and inclusion. I'm really excited to unpack the subject of D&I and to do it particularly from a race perspective is how we wanted to focus on that. And then last, in the middle here, for those of you that missed it last week, we partnered with HRCI and we did a webinar on the 6 elements of a leadership mindset. So HRCI has this Alchemizing HR series. We had about 3,500 people in attendance, a lot of good dialogue and discussion. And as part of that, we provided an ebook for these 6 elements that Terry Schell and I have co-created. And if you'd like access to that ebook, there's a free download describing what those 6 elements are. So just trying to add value to our HR community. If you have any questions, if you want to talk about this Capstone Coaching or any of the other things that we're doing, feel free to give me or anybody on our team a call afterwards. Oops, my chair just almost broke here. Sorry. And with that, any last closing comments, guys?
First call is always free.
Okay. Well, thanks all.
I would just offer, Steve, that again, that this is going to be a more competitive landscape, and it takes oftentimes a few years to really have a solid program in place. So again, the people who are the early starters on this are going to gain the most competitive advantage. And I think that's what we're all looking for from an organizational perspective is how do we gain competitive advantage? And this is one of those ways that you can, given the projected shortfall of talent.
Well said, Kris. Well, thanks. Hopefully we can help you in some way, shape, or form on this topic, and hopefully we'll see you on a future webinar. And again, James and Kris, thanks so much for your time and expertise today.
Thanks for having us, and look forward to next time.
Bye.
Thanks, Steve.